Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, we are going to just dive right into this today because we're untangling one of the absolutely most fascinating financial stories in modern sports. We're looking at the quiet, explosive, and completely undeniable billion-dollar takeover of women's football.
I want to start with a number that might literally break your brain a little bit. In 2024, a football team that lost over $11 million in a single year sold for $257 million. No, that is not a typo. This team had literally never turned a profit, and yet someone happily paid $250 million for it. Why? Because that team was a women's football club, and right now the smart money believes women's football is one of the most underpriced assets on the entire planet.
But, this massive influx of cash brings up a fascinating mystery. And really, it's this central question we're going to answer in this explainer. If the money is pouring in, who is actually getting rich? We constantly hear about this billion-dollar boom, but is it the players cashing in, the clubs, the investors? I want you to hold on to that question, because the answer is probably not what you think. Let's follow the money.
So here is our roadmap for today. 1. The billion-dollar boom. 2. Clubs and investors buying in. 3. What players actually earn. 4. The brand sponsorship rush. 5. Who is getting rich. And 6. Where it is heading.
All right, part 1. The billion-dollar boom, the spark of 2023.
To really understand where we are today, we have to rewind to the moment everything changed, the undeniable catalyst. Look at the sheer scale of this leap. The 2019 World Cup had already proven the concept, pulling in a massive 1.12 billion viewers globally. But going into 2023, FIFA projected the tournament could reach up to 2 billion viewers around the world. And on the ground, more than 1.5 million tickets were sold, making it the most attended standalone women's sporting event ever staged. This proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't just a niche event anymore. We're talking about a massive, global audience.
So how do you turn all those global eyeballs into actual money? Let's look at the numbers the analysts at Deloitte track. This brilliantly illustrates the trajectory we're on. Across all women's elite sports, global revenue was around $692 million back in 2022. By 2024, it had nearly tripled, crossing $1 billion for the very first time, to land at $1.88 billion. And the projections? They forecast it reaching an incredible $3 billion by 2026. That is a staggering 340% jump in just 4 years across all women's sports.
But let's narrow in on our specific topic today, because football is actually one of the biggest drivers of that broader growth. In 2025, women's football alone generated roughly $820 million in global revenue. So when people say women's football is essentially a billion-dollar business, it's not just marketing hype. That is the actual verifiable data. $820 million is flowing through this sport every single year.
Moving on to part 2, clubs and investors buying in, valuations, and the smart money.
With nearly $1 billion sloshing around, you might just assume players are getting rich, right? But hold that thought. Let's look at the owners first. Remember that $250 million sale from our cold hook? That was Chelsea's women's team. They were valued at around $257 million in 2024, making them the most valuable women's football club on the planet. But here's the kicker. That valuation was about 17 times the team's annual revenue. Why on earth would anyone pay that? Because investors don't pay 17 times revenue for what something earns today. They pay it for what they confidently believe it's going to earn tomorrow. And Chelsea isn't an anomaly here. Across the Atlantic, the American club Angel City had already commanded a $250 million valuation.
And the smart money just keeps flowing in. In 2025, Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit and husband to Serena Williams, bought a minority stake in Chelsea's women's team for roughly £20 million. This investment represents a very simple, very powerful belief that European women's football is about to experience the exact same massive commercial boom that the American leagues are already seeing. In England's Women's Super League, the top clubs grew their combined revenue by 34% in a single season. Every serious club out there is now treating its women's team as a core growth asset.
And hey, if investors ever needed proof that fans will actually show up to support these valuations, they literally just have to look at Barcelona. Barcelona Femine didn't just win trophies, they packed the Camp Nou with crowds of more than 90,000 people. They completely shattered attendance records for women's club football. This single metric, 90,000 plus fans buying tickets to a single match, proved to investors that demand was no longer theoretical. It was visible, it was loud, and it was entirely sold out.
Part 3. What players actually earn. The uncomfortable truth.
Okay, so clubs are valued in the hundreds of millions. Revenue is approaching $1 billion, stadiums are packed, but prepare for a bit of whiplash here. According to a 2025 FIFA report, the average salary for a professional women's footballer worldwide is about $10,900 a year. Let that sink in. Across the global game, the average is under $11,000. Despite the billion-dollar boom happening above them, the vast majority of professional women footballers still cannot live on the sport alone.
Now, to be totally fair, at the very top, things are changing remarkably fast. Let's look at this comparison. While the global average floor sits at that shocking $10,900, over in America's NWSL, the league minimum salary climbed to $48,500 in 2025. Even better, it's locked in to rise to $82,500 by 2030, with the current league average already sitting around $117,000. We're seeing similar strides in England, where a salary floor was introduced guaranteeing senior players at least £40,000. And of course, the absolute elite superstars, they're earning well into the six figures with massive sponsorships on top.
So the crucial point is captured perfectly right here. The money is flowing, it's just not flowing evenly. The ceiling of the sport is rising incredibly fast for the top leagues and the top stars, but the floor for the average global player remains very, very low. It's a total split reality.
Part 4. The Brand Sponsorship Rush, Funding the Growth.
So if the players aren't absorbing all this revenue and the clubs are pushing for growth, who is actually funding this massive surge? Well, the single biggest chunk of women's sports revenue today doesn't come from ticket sales or broadcast rights alone. It actually comes from commercial deals. We're talking about sponsorships, partnerships, and merchandise. In 2024, that commercial slice crossed $1 billion for the first time across women's sports, making up more than 50% of all revenue.
Why are global megabrands pouring over $1 billion into this? Because they figured out a really powerful secret. Women's sports, and football in particular, reaches an audience that is younger, way more engaged, and incredibly loyal. Studies consistently show that fans of women's sports are much more likely to remember and trust the brands that sponsor their teams. These companies aren't writing checks for charity, right? They're buying direct access to a premium demographic, and they are locking in those relationships while the entry price is still relatively low compared to the men's game.
All right, part 5. Who is getting rich? The big reveal.
Which finally brings us to the core question we asked at the very beginning of this explainer. With hundreds of millions of dollars changing hands, who is actually getting rich? Right now, the wealth is basically being captured by three distinct groups. First, the early investors and club owners who are buying assets at valuations they believe will look incredibly cheap in just 5 years. Second, a small handful of elite, highly marketable star players who command real salaries and lucrative brand deals. And third, the brands and broadcasters who are locking in long-term deals while the sport is still undervalued. But who's still waiting? The thousands of ordinary professional players who make up the actual backbone of the sport, many of whom are still earning below a living wage. Enormous value is being created, but right now it's primarily being captured at the very top.
Part 6. Where it is heading, the future market.
Because look, the momentum here is absolutely not slowing down. In fact, it's accelerating. This timeline lays out the future market perfectly. We went from $1.88 billion in total women's sports revenue in 2024, and we are on a direct, undeniable trajectory to hit a projected $3 billion in 2026. But look at 2027. The 2027 Women's World Cup in Brazil already has its US streaming rights locked up by Netflix. When the biggest streaming platform on earth buys in to broadcast the World Cup, it tells you everything you need to know about the value of this audience. Women's football has completely graduated from a feel-good story to a serious, heavyweight financial market.
And that really leaves us with a provocative final thought. The boom is real, the numbers are verified, and the billionaires are already placing their bets. The real question isn't whether women's football is a billion-dollar business anymore. The real question is whether you'll understand it before everyone else does. If this explainer changed how you view the business behind the game, make sure to hit subscribe because we are going to keep tracking exactly where this money goes next. Thanks for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next one.